There are a lot of videos out there now talking about how different life is now from 2020. And you see titles like Something is Off in Society and it's terrifying, or Something is Different About People and Everyone's Noticing Now, which are kind of, clickbaity titles. But I do think the basic idea is correct. And a lot of that has to do with how much things have changed since 2020. And I will even put it this way: the world ended in 2020. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, the world we knew in 2019 and before, and I'll get to that in a minute, is completely gone forever. We will never get it back. And the funny thing is, that's what everyone is still comparing life in the mid 2020s now to, because that's the most recent previous version of the world that everybody knew. And in so many ways, we did end up with a new normal that we were told was inevitable anyway. So I want to expand this perspective a little bit because a lot of those videos come from people in their 20s and some younger than that. And so the idea I want to talk about is that the world ends every so often. And when that does happen, and like I said, by in the world ending, I mean a major world event changes the trajectory of things, it changes the social fabric, things like that. It basically makes the previous version disappear, and the new version, so to speak, is unrecognizable until it's eventually accepted as normal, I guess would be the way to put it. So I want to expand on this idea by adding my perspective. So a little background: I'm almost 40, and the way I see it, the world has ended three times in my lifetime from my perspective and experience. And I also want to say, I realize this could be different. Like if you are Russian, say, or you're in one of the former Soviet republics, then, the fall of the Soviet Union would be the end of the world from your point of view, probably. But anyway, as an almost 40-year-old American, I think the world has ended three times in my lifetime. And of course, the first one was 9/11. And I first realized I was getting old once I realized that 9/11 is taught as a historical event in school now. And that's perfectly logical because if you are 20 years old now, then obviously you were born after 9/11 happened and all of the changes to the social fabric of this country and the world and the social contract and all that. So for someone who was born after it or maybe born right around it so they don't have memories of it, the world since 9/11 is just normal to them. That was their baseline as a kid. Just like as a millennial who's almost 40, my baseline was the very positive, optimistic, upbeat 90s, where there was a good kid culture and, the Soviet Union had fallen and America was on top, and things like movies and music and stuff like that just seemed a lot better, and video games, which of course I know everyone's going to think that the stuff they grew up with is the best, but I digress. But if you grew up in the 90s or the 80s, um, 9/11 just utterly changed things. And if you didn't live through it and see those changes firsthand and experience the world as it used to be, then it's really hard to explain it. I mean, you can explain it in logical terms, but it inevitably winds up in the realm of experience and emotion and childhoods and things like that. And so you can only convey how different it was to an extent. So the second time the world ended in my lifetime was the great financial crisis in 2008. And that wasn't as broad as 9/11, I guess, even though it did actually affect the whole world to varying extents. But from my perspective and the perspective of many millennials out there, the great financial crisis in 2008 was essentially the end of the American dream. Now, people didn't accept that overnight. And of course, if you were a baby boomer, you had already had your American dream. And so you didn't, baby boomers at that time didn't understand that it was gone, that it was dead. And even, I mean, initially, no one really accepted it and internalized it, not at first. Because if you were a millennial, there was a good chance you were still in college then, which I was. And so the reality didn't start hitting you right away. It maybe took, 2 or 3 or 4 years, depending on how old you were. But I mean, and I compare this to now because I know Gen Z is struggling horribly with the job market and the economy and all of this stuff. And it brings back memories of when I was in my 20s and I graduated, and it was horrible too. And I mean, I remember when I graduated almost 20 years ago, you couldn't get a menial, retail monkey job or some kind of, mech job. You couldn't get anything. I mean, I remember it took me several months to just get my first crappy job after college. And I mean, it was almost a year after college that I got that. And it wasn't heavily related to my field. It was kind of related on the fringes a little bit, but I'm not going to go into that too much. But anyway, that was the second end of the world in my lifetime. So one utterly changed the social contract and the social fabric of society and the culture, and then one was more of a vastly changed economic outlooks and prospects, and the great financial crisis ruined a lot of futures. 9/11 ruined a lot of futures, obviously. And that's a key part of an event being like the end of the world, is it greatly changes or destroys a lot of futures that people were planning on. And I guess one thing I'll add to it is between 9/11 and somewhere around the Great Financial Crisis, there were a lot of subtle changes too that if you grew up in the 90s or 80s, you really did notice. Like people were more paranoid, they got colder, people got more self-absorbed and narcissistic. And yes, I will say that people talk about narcissist on the internet constantly now, and I agree that the level of narcissism has risen greatly in the world, probably largely to the internet and social media culture. But there really have been times when it was not always like that. A level of self-interest and self-absorption has always existed, and it's always been strong, I would say. It's just that things got so stark after 9/11 and the great financial crisis, and then later COVID, which I'll get to in a minute, that that it can be hard to think that things haven't always been this way. But yeah, also around the early 2000s, I mean, kids started playing outside less and less often. People gradually stopped getting to know their neighbors. Like if you moved into a new neighborhood or whatever. Obviously, things like flying got a lot worse, a lot less pleasant. So you sort of had things destroyed socially with 9/11, and then financially during the Great Financial Crisis or Great Recession, whatever you want to call it. And then, of course, you had the increasing political and social polarization of the 2010s, which I don't really consider an end of the world. It was more of an interim period. And from my perspective, some people might see that differently. If you have a different perspective on that, please let us know in the comments, because this is really a fascinating discussion that I always like to hear more about. So, anyway, fast forward past the political polarization of the 2010s, and then you have COVID in 2020. And, I won't go into the details because this is fresh in everybody's mind, no matter how old you are, because it was so recent. But we are living in a time, and I think the whole 2020s will be defined this way, where they still haven't internalized and accepted this massive change. And, or maybe we're in the very early times of that happening, but we're not there yet. And I'm not saying that people should just blithely accept how bad things have gotten because, well, that's a whole other discussion. But I do think that's more or less inevitable that an acceptance will eventually wash over people. And then, in a long enough timeline, generations pass away and then new ones are born and their baseline is different. On that note, and this is not anything I stand to benefit from, but if you've never read The Fourth Turning by Strauss and Howe, I recommend it. I read that book a few years ago, and it's not exactly scientific, although they do pull on a lot of history and data, and research, but it's sort of more art than science. But they do a really good job, in my opinion, of explaining generational differences and how that leads to cycles in history. So, if nothing else, it's a very compelling and fascinating read. Anyway, so what I would say, especially for younger people, probably Gen Z, or maybe the upcoming Gen Alpha, It's going to be hard to do, but it's probably best to accept that the old world you used to know is not coming back. Just as for millennials or and other generations too. I'm not saying only the last 40 years have had this. This has always happened throughout history. There are many examples. But things will never go back to normal. And I think the best thing to do going forward is probably to study history, to study these historical cycles and generational cycles. Build your discipline, which I would say, mental, physical, spiritual, financial discipline, emotional discipline, things like that. But I may talk about that toward the end of the video a little bit more. So, the world you grow up in is inevitably going to be lost, regardless of your generation. So, yeah, of course, if you're a baby boomer, the world you grew up in doesn't exist. If you're Gen X, if you're millennial, and now if you're Gen Z or Gen Alpha, the world you grew up in does not exist anymore, and it's not coming back. The old world will not return. And the last thing I'll say about this topic for now is the next world ending event is going to happen, and I'm guessing it's going to happen before 2030 hits, just because things feel like they're going so fast, and history and geopolitics are just coming at us so fast. I may make a prediction video about that in the future because I do have some ideas about what that's going to look like. Let me know in the comments if you would like to see a video like that. It's possible that that event may have already happened and we don't realize it just yet. I think the Iran war and the resulting uh, oil crisis is possibly one of those events, and it's just we haven't seen it really culminate yet. So anyway, thank you for listening, and if you wouldn't mind, like, share, and subscribe, and all that YouTube stuff because it helps me out and helps me keep doing what I'm doing. And I would love to know your opinions about this topic, so please drop those in the comments. I will read everything and try to respond to everything, and we'll see you in the next one.